Okay, sorry about that. That was the cat. Stupid. Okay, so again, he pushed the stop button. Anyways, continuing on with that paragraph on the bottom of page 44, instead of rambling, this party had preserved a dignified homogeneity and assumed to itself the function of representing the staid nobility of the countryside, East Egg, condescending or looking down upon West Egg, and carefully on guard against its spectroscopic gaiety. Seriously, cat? Get out of here. Go. You can't. No, don't sit on the computer. Sorry. Top of page 45. Let's get out, whispered Jordan after a somehow wasteful and inappropriate half hour. Again, not doing anything. This is much too polite for me. We got up, and she explained that we were going to find the host. I had never met him, she said, and it was making me uneasy. The undergraduate nodded in a cynical, melancholy way. The bar, page 45, where we glanced first, was crowded, but Gatsby was not there. She couldn't find him from the top of the steps, and he wasn't on the veranda. Veranda is like an upstairs patio, okay? On a chance, we tried an important-looking door and walked into a high Gothic library, paneled with carved English oak, and probably transported complete from some ruin overseas, very luxurious. A stout, middle-aged man with enormous owl-eyed spectacles was sitting somewhat drunk on the edge of a table, staring with unsteady concentration at the shelves of books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. "What do you think?" he demanded impetuously. Remember, impetuously is suddenly and kind of with anger. About what? He waved his hand toward the bookshelves. About that. As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain or to find out. I ascertained. They're real. The books? He nodded. Absolutely real. Have pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice, durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages in here. Let me show you. See where he says Lemmy, L-E-M-M-E? That's him using language to show that this owl-eyed man, that's how we refer to him because of his glasses, that he's drunk. Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with volume 1 of the Stoddard Lectures. "See," he cried triumphantly, "it's a bona fide, or genuine, piece of printed matter." It fooled me. This fellow's a regular Belasco. Now, you're going to need to look up what Belasco means, okay? Or ask me about it. It's a triumph, top of page 46. What thoroughness, what realism. Knew when to stop, too, didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect? He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. "Who brought you?" he demanded. "Or did you just come?" "I was brought. Most people were brought." Jordan looked at him alertly, cheerfully, without answering. "I was brought by a woman named Roosevelt," he continued. "Mrs. Claude Roosevelt. Do you know her? I met her somewhere last night. I've been drunk for about a week now, and I thought it might sober me up to sit in the library." Again, alcohol. "Has it?" "A little bit, I think. I can't tell yet. I've only been here an hour." "Did I tell you about the books? They're real. You told us." We shook hands with him gravely and went back outdoors. Okay, this whole part about the books. So, this guy, owl-eyed man, may or may not be from East Egg, but because Gatsby is West Egg and new money, he's expecting all the books to be a sham, to be fake, right? So he's like, look, they're real. This guy did a really good job of making sure that we knew everything was real, all right? So it's highlighting the differences between old money and new money. New money being like fake, thinking this is how rich people should act. But he's surprised to find out that the books are actually real, okay? A huge example of carelessness. I've been drunk for about a week, okay? Last big paragraph on page 46. There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden. Again, that's like the stage. Old men pushing young girls backward into eternal graceless circles, superior couples holding each other torturously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners, and a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. A celebrated tenor, this is a singer, okay, had sung in Italian, and a notorious contralto had sung in jazz. Contralto, again, another singer. And between the numbers, people were doing, quote, stunts all over the garden, think circus, while happy, vacuous bursts of laughter rose toward the summer sky. Remember, vacuous means empty, without any ideas. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the girls in yellow, did a baby act in costume, so they were acting like babies. And champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. The moon had risen higher, and floating in the sound was a triangle of silver scales trembling a little to the stiff, tinny drip of the banjos on the lawn, top of page 47. I was still with Jordan Baker. We were sitting at a table with a man of about my age and a rowdy little girl who gave way upon the slightest provocation to uncontrollable laughter. I was enjoying myself now. I'd even taken 2 finger bowls of champagne, okay, and that just means like almost like drinking bowls. And the scene had changed before my eyes into something significant, elemental and profound. At a lull in the entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. "Your face is familiar," he said politely. "Weren't you in the 3rd Division during the war?" "Why, yes, I was in the 9th Machine Gun Battalion. I was in the 7th Infantry until June 1918. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before." We talked for a moment about some wet, gray little villages in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. A hydroplane is an airplane that has, like, rafts on the bottom so it can land on the water. "Want to go with me, old sport? Just near the shore along the Sound." "What time?" "Well, any time that suits you best." It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. "Having a gay time now?" she inquired. "Much better." I turned again to my new acquaintance, the person I just met. "This is an unusual party for me," says Nick. I haven't even seen the host. I live over there." I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in the distance, and this man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation. Top of page 48. For a moment he looked at me as if he failed to understand. "I'm Gatsby," he said suddenly. "What?" I exclaimed. "Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host." Okay, so this is an example of irony here. So you should write down lit device irony. The whole thing is that it's ironic is that Nick is talking about Gatsby to his face, right? So it's like saying, "Oh, I know this girl or this teacher named Miss Barman, and she has this crazy curly hair. Do you know her?" And that's like someone saying it to me, and I'm like, "Oh, I'm Miss Barman." Like, so it's a really awkward meeting for Nick. Now, here we go, hearing some really crazy description about our guy Gatsby, who's been a mystery so far. So on page 48, it says, "He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. Like very, very genuine, honest. Like when he smiles at you, he really means it. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that at your best you hoped to convey." Precisely at that point, it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or 2 over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech, underline that part, just missed being absurd. Absurd? Ridiculous. Okay, so the formality of speech, elaborate formality of speech is the way Gatsby talks. It's like he's trying too hard. Sometime before he introduced himself, I got a strong impression that he was picking his words with care. And I underlined that part too. A strong impression that he was picking his words with care. Why is he talking that way? Almost at the moment when Mr. Gatsby identified himself, a butler hurried toward him with the information that Chicago was calling him on the wire. Okay, on the phone. Right? He excused himself with a small bow that included each of us in turn. "If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport," he urged me. "Excuse me, I will rejoin you later." When he was gone, I turned immediately to Jordan, constrained to assure her of my surprise. Now, I had expected that Mr. Gatsby would be a florid, look that up, and corpulent person in his middle years, kind of like fat. "Who is he?" I demanded. "Do you know?" "He's just a man named Gatsby." Top of page 49. "Where is he from, and what does he do?" "Now you're started on the subject," she answered with this wan smile. "Well, he told me once he was an Oxford man." A dim background started to take shape behind him, but at her next remark, it faded away. "However, I don't believe it." "Why not?" "I don't know," she insisted. "I just don't think he went there." Now, Oxford is a very expensive, famous college in England. It's in London, okay? Kind of like Yale or Harvard. You got to be rich and you got to know somebody to get in. And Jordan doesn't believe it. So we've got two impressions of Gatsby, that he's faking and choosing his words with care, and that we're not quite sure if we believe what he's saying. Top of page 49, the paragraph that starts with "something in her tone." Something in her tone reminded me of other girls. I think he killed a man and had the effect of stimulating my curiosity. I would have accepted without question the information that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana, from the Lower East Side of New York. That was comprehensible or understandable. But young men didn't, at least in my provincial or backwoods experience. I believe they didn't. Drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a place on Long Island Sound, right? Young men, like 32, don't have enough money to buy this kind of elaborate house on Long Island Sound. "Anyhow, he gives large parties," said Jordan, changing the subject with an urban distaste for the concrete. "And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy." There was the boom of a bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the echolalia of the garden. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried, "at the request of Mr. Gatsby, we are going to play for you Mr. Vladimir Tolstoy's latest work, which attracted so much attention at Carnegie Hall last May. If you read the papers, you know that there was a big sensation." He smiled with jovial or happy condescension, and added, "some sensation," whereupon everybody laughed. "This piece is known," he concluded lustily, "as Vladimir Tolstoy's Jazz History of the World." So now they're going to play some music. Top of page 50. The nature of Mr. Tolstoy's composition or music eluded me, escaped me, because just as it began, my eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with his approving eyes. His tan skin was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. I could see nothing sinister or kind of evil about him. I wondered if the fact that he was not drinking helped to set him off from his guest, for it seemed to me that he grew more correct as the fraternal hilarity increased. So as things get crazier on the party, he seems to get more not drunk or, correct. When the Jazz History of the World was over, girls were putting their heads on men's shoulders in a puppyish, convivial way. Girls were swooning backward playfully into men's arms, even into groups, knowing that someone would arrest their falls. But no one swooned backwards on Gatsby, and no French bob touched Gatsby's shoulder, and no singing quartets were formed with Gatsby's head for one link. "I beg your pardon." Gatsby's butler was suddenly standing beside us. "Miss Baker," he inquired, "I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone." "With me?" she exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, madam." She got up slowly, raising her eyebrows at me in an astonishment, and followed the butler toward the house. I noticed that she wore her evening dress, all her dresses, like sports clothes. There was a jauntiness, cheerful, confident about her movements, as if she had first learned to walk upon golf courses on clean, crisp mornings. I was alone, and it was almost 2 a.m. For some time, confused and intriguing sounds had issued from a long, many-windowed room which overhung the terrace, eluding Jordan's undergraduate, who was now engaged in an obstetrical conversation with 2 chorus girls, and who implored me to join him. I went inside. 51. The large room was full of people. One of the girls in yellow was playing the piano, and beside her stood a tall, red-haired young lady from a famous chorus engaged in song. She had drunk a quantity of champagne, and during the course of her song she had decided, ineptly, that everything was very, very sad. She was not only singing, she was weeping, too. Whenever there was a pause in the song, she filled it with gasping, broken sobs, and then took up the lyric again in a quavering soprano. The tears coursed down her cheeks. Not freely, however, for when they came into contact with her heavily beaded eyelashes, they assumed an inky color and pursued the rest of their way in slow black rivulets. So it's like she's crying and there's black rivers running down her face. Okay, a humorous suggestion was made that she sing the notes on her face, whereupon she threw up her hands and sank into a chair and went off into a deep vinous sleep. Vinous, I believe, has to do with wine. Okay, again, this is an example of just drunk people acting like complete imbeciles. She had a fight with a man who says he's her husband, explained a girl at my elbow. I looked around. Most of the remaining women were now having fights with men said to be their husbands. So what does that tell you about relationships of rich people? That they're very violent and there's problems. And why said to be their husband? So that there's a lot of infidelity or cheating going on. Even Jordan's party, the quartet from East Egg, were rent asunder. They were broken up by dissension. One of the men was talking with curious intensity to a young actress, and his wife, after attempting to laugh at the situation in a dignified and indifferent way, broke down entirely and resorted to flank attacks. They're fighting. At intervals, she appeared suddenly at his side like an angry diamond and hissed, "You promised," into his ear. Again, total infidelity. You promised you wouldn't flirt with anyone. You promised not to be cheating this time. The reluctance to go home was not confined to wayward men. The hall was at present occupied by two deplorably sober men and their highly indignant wives. So two sober people whose wives don't want to go home. Their wives were sympathizing with each other in slightly raised voices. "Whenever he sees I'm having a good time, he wants to go home. Never heard anything so selfish in my life. We're always the first ones to leave. So are we." "Well, we're almost the last tonight," said one of the men sheepishly. "The orchestra left half an hour ago." In spite of this wives' agreement that such malevolence, remember, malevolence is evil, bad, was beyond credibility, the dispute ended in a short struggle as both wives were lifted, kicking into the night. They didn't want to leave. As I waited for my hat in the hall, the door of the library opened, and Jordan Baker and Gatsby came out together. He was saying some last word to her, but the eagerness in his manner tightened abruptly into formality as several people approached him to say goodbye. Jordan's party were calling impatiently to her from the porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. "I've just heard the most amazing thing," she whispered. "How long were we in there?" "Why, about an hour. It was simply amazing," she repeated abstractedly. "But I swore I wouldn't tell it, and here I am tantalizing you or teasing you." She yawned gracefully in my face. "Please come and see me. Phone book. Under the name of Mrs. Sigourney Howard, my aunt." She was hurrying off as she talked. Her brown hand waved a jaunty salute as she melted into her party at the door. Rather ashamed that on my first appearance I had stayed so late, I joined the last of Gatsby's guests, who were clustered around him. I wanted to explain that I'd hunted for him early in the evening and to apologize for not having known him in the garden. Top of 53. "Don't mention it." He enjoined me eagerly. "Don't give it another thought, old sport." The familiar expression held no more formality than the hand which reassuringly brushed my shoulder. "And don't forget, we're going up in the hydroplane tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Then the butler behind his shoulder. "Philadelphia wants you on the phone, sir." "All right, in a minute. Tell them I'll be right there." "Good night." "Good night." "Good night." He smiled, and suddenly there seemed to be a pleasant significance in having been among the last to go, as if he had desired it all the time. "Good night, old sport." "Good night." But as I walked down the steps, I saw that the evening was not quite over. 50 feet from the door, a dozen headlights. Okay, so Nick's outside now. A dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene. Remember, tumultuous means kind of violent and disorderly. In the ditch, beside the road, right side up, but violently shorn or cut of one wheel, rested a new coupe, which is a car, which had left Gatsby's drive not 2 minutes before. The sharp jut of a wall accounted for the detachment of the wheel, which was now getting considerable attention from half a dozen curious chauffeurs. However, as they had left their cars blocking the road, a harsh, discordant din from those in the rear had been audible for some time, and added to the already violent confusion of the scene. That sentence that starts with however, harsh, discordant din, that's like a bunch of cars pounding on their horns, right? Lots of horns, because now there's this big traffic jam. And what has happened in this paragraph, which is kind of hard to tell, one of the cars in the driveway backing out hit a wall, and a whole tire was completely cut off of the vehicle, okay? And now there's this big, huge, commotion. A man in a long duster, a coat, had dismounted from the wreck and now stood in the middle of the road, looking from the car to the tire and from the tire to the observers in a pleasant, puzzled way. See, he explained, it went in the ditch. The fact was infinitely astonishing to him, and I recognized first the unusual quality of wonder, and then on the man. It was the late patron of Gatsby's library, so Allied Man. Allied Man is the one who has wrecked his car backing out of Gatsby's driveway. How did it happen? He shrugged his shoulders. I know nothing whatever about mechanics, he said decisively. But how did it happen? Did you run into the wall? Don't ask me, said Allies, washing his hands of the whole matter. I know very little about driving, next to nothing. It happened, that's all I know. Well, if you're a poor driver, you oughtn't to try driving at night. But I wasn't even trying, he explained indignantly. I wasn't even trying. An awed hush fell upon the bystanders. Do you want to commit suicide? You're lucky it was just a wheel. A bad driver, not even trying. But you don't understand, explained the criminal. I wasn't driving. There's another man in the car. The shock that followed this declaration found voice in a sustained as the door of the coupe swung slowly open. The crowd, it was now a crowd, stepped back involuntarily, and when the door had opened wide, there was a ghostly pause. Then, very gradually, part by part, a pale, dangling individual stepped out of the wreck, pawing tentatively at the ground with a large, uncertain dancing shoe. So dude's sticking his foot out of the ground, like trying to find footing. Sticking his foot out of the car, Blinded by the glare of the headlights and confused by the incessant groaning of the horns, the apparition, apparition is ghost, stood swaying for a moment before he perceived the man in the duster. What's the matter? He inquired calmly. Did we run out of gas? Top of 55. Look! Half a dozen fingers pointed at the amputated wheel. He stared at it for a moment and then looked upward as though he suspected that it had come off and dropped from the sky. It came off, someone explained. He nodded. At first I didn't always notice we'd stopped. A pause, then taking a long breath and straightening his shoulders, he remarked in a determined voice, Wonder if someone would tell me where there's a gasoline station. At least a dozen men, some of them a little better off than he was, aka some of them hardly less drunk than he was, explained to him that wheel and car were no longer joined by any physical bond. Back out, he suggested as a moment. Put her in reverse. But the wheel's off. He hesitated. No harm in trying. Just showing you how drunk and careless this dude is. The caterwauling horns had reached a crescendo. Again, there's some diction there, caterwauling and crescendo. And I turned away and cut across the lawn toward home. I glanced back at once. A wafer of a moon was shining over Gatsby's house, making the night fine as before and surviving the laughter and the sound of his still glowing garden. A sudden emptiness seemed to flow now from the windows and the great doors, endowing with complete isolation the figure of the host, who stood on the porch, his hand up in a formal gesture of farewell. Reading over what I have written so far, I see I have given the impression that the events of 3 nights several weeks apart were all that absorbed me. On the contrary, they were merely casual events in a crowded summer, and until much later they absorbed me infinitely less than my personal affairs. Most of the time I worked. In the early morning the sun threw my shadow westward as I hurried down the white chasms of lower New York and the Probity Trust. He's talking about working. I knew the other clerks and young bond salesmen by their first names and lunched with them in dark, crowded restaurants on little pig sausages and mashed potatoes and coffee. I even had a short affair with a girl who lived in Jersey City and worked in the accounting department, but her brother began throwing mean looks in my direction, so when she went on her vacation in July, I let it blow quietly away. I took dinner usually at the Yale Club. For some reason, it was the gloomiest event of my day. And then I went upstairs to the library and studied investments and securities for a conscientious hour. There were generally a few rioters around, but they never came into the library, so it was a good place to work. After that, if the night was mellow, I strolled down Madison Avenue past the old Murray Hill Hotel and over 33rd Street to Pennsylvania Station. So I was talking all about New York. I began to like New York, the racy, adventurous feel of it at night, and the satisfaction that the constant flicker of men and women and machines give to the restless eye. I liked to walk up Fifth Avenue and pick out romantic women from the crowd and imagine that in a few minutes I was going to enter into their lives and no one would ever know or disapprove. Sometimes in my mind I followed them to their apartments on the corners of hidden streets, and they turned and smiled back at me before they faded through a door into a warm darkness. It's kind of creepy, right? At the enchanted metropolitan city twilight, I felt a haunting loneliness sometimes, and felt it in others. Poor young clerks who loitered in front of windows, waiting until it was time for a solitary restaurant dinner. Young clerks in the dusk, wasting the most poignant moments of night and life. Wasting the most poignant moments of night and life. He says he finds all of this lonely. Again at 8 o'clock, when the dark lanes of the 40s, again those are streets, were 5 deep with throbbing taxicabs bound for the theater district, I felt a sinking in my heart. Forms leaned together in the taxis as they waited, and voices sang, and there was laughter from unheard jokes, and lighted cigarettes outlined unintelligible gestures inside. Imagining that I, too, was hurrying towards gaiety, like something fun, and sharing their intimate excitement, I wished them well. Now, for a while, I lost sight of Jordan Baker, and then in midsummer, I found her again. At first, I was flattered to go places with her because she was a golf champion, and everyone knew her name. Then it was something more. I wasn't actually in love, but I felt a sort of tender curiosity. The bored, haughty, or snobby face that she turned to the world concealed something. Most affectations conceal something eventually, even though they don't in the beginning. And one day I found what it was, okay? So he's like, the way she presents herself is hiding something, and now he figured it out. When we were on a house party together up in Warwick, she left a borrowed car out in the rain with the top down, and then lied about it. And suddenly I remembered the story about her that had eluded me that night at Daisy's. At her first big golf tournament, there was a row, okay, some sort of argument, a row is like an argument, that newly reached the newspapers, a suggestion that she had moved her ball from a bad lie in the semifinal round. The thing approached the proportions of a scandal and then died away. A caddy retracted his statement, and the only other witness admitted that he might have been mistaken. The incident and the name had remained together in my mind. Okay, so he's talking about how he's figured it out now. Jordan lies. She's dishonest. Jordan Baker instinctively avoided clever, shrewd men. And now I saw that this was because she felt on a safer plane, top of 58, where any divergence from a code would be thought impossible. She was incurably dishonest. So I underlined that in marked characterization of Jordan. She wasn't able to endure being at a disadvantage, and given this unwillingness, I suppose she had begun dealing in subterfuges or tricks when she was very young in order to keep that cool, insolent smile turned to the world, and yet to satisfy the demands of her hard, jaunty body. So basically, she says, Nick is saying that Jordan avoids smart guys because she thinks that they might catch on to her. It made no difference to me. Dishonesty in a woman is a thing you never blame deeply. I was casually sorry, and then I forgot. It was on that same house party that we had a curious conversation about driving a car. It started because she passed so close, she was driving, and passed so close to some workmen that our fender flicked a button on one man's coat. "You're a rotten driver," I protested. "Either you ought to be more careful, or you oughtn't to drive at all." "I am careful." "No, you're not." "Well, other people are," she said lightly. "What's that got to do with it?" "They'll keep out of my way," she insisted. "It takes two to make an accident." "Well, suppose you met someone just as careless as yourself." "I hope I never will," she answered. "I hate careless people. That's why I like you." Okay, so she's being very two-faced, right? She herself is careless. Her gray, sun-strained eyes stared straight ahead, but she had deliberately shifted our relations, and for a moment I thought I loved her. But I am slow thinking and full of interior rules or morals that act as brakes on my desires, and I knew that first I had to get myself definitely out of that tangle back home. I'd been writing letters once a week and signing them "Love, Nick." And all I could think of was how when a certain girl played tennis, a faint mustache of perspiration or sweat appeared on her upper lip. Nevertheless, there was a vague understanding that had to be tactfully broken off before I was free. Everyone suspects himself of at least one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I am one of the few honest people that I have ever known. Okay, two things here. When he's talking about cardinal virtues, he's referencing Ben Franklin. Remember Ben Franklin's virtues list? Yay! And what's ironic here is he's saying he's one of the few honest people that he's ever known, but he's also admitting that he has been in a kind of tangle back home or some long-distance relationship with some chick. At the same time, he's kind of dating Jordan. So he says he's honest, but his actions say something else. And that, my loves, is the end of chapter 3. See you tomorrow.